Daniel Mitchell over at the Cato Institute put something up on his blog yesterday that I found interesting. It was about the minimum wage, and he wrote this. He said, even though the Obama administration claimed that squandering $800 billion or so on so-called stimulus would keep the joblessness rate below 8%, the unemployment rate today is almost 10%. There are many reasons for the economy's tepid performance, including a larger burden of government spending and the dampening effect of a future tax rate increase, because tax rates are going to jump, of course, January 1st, 2011, when the 2003 tax cuts expire. He said, though, a closer look at the unemployment data suggests that the minimum wage law also deserves a big share of the blame. And there was this report that's out from a group called the Center for Freedom and Prosperity that indicates that politicians destroyed jobs when they increased the minimum wage by more than 40% over a 3-year period. So I wanted to get some thoughts on this from my economic go-to guy here in St. Louis, and that's David Rose, professor of economics and chair of the economics department at UMSL. He joins us this afternoon. Professor Rose, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
All right, so I saw this article that came out about the minimum wage, and I've been thinking about this a little bit lately, especially with the jobs numbers that have come out. I thought we'd tap into your vast knowledge and insight on this particular topic, because the prediction is often made that an increase in the minimum wage is going to hurt part-time jobs in particular. Businesses won't be able to afford employees at that level. Is that true or false? Is that sort of playing itself out, especially in 2010?
Well, that's a question. I hate giving answers like this because people always suspect you're up to no good. But it's both true and false. And understanding why it's both true and false sheds a great deal of light on the politics of the minimum wage. When politicians increase the minimum wage, historically, they've been careful to only increase it when the labor market is fairly hot, and therefore employment is growing fairly rapidly. The reason why they do this is the minimum wage definitely reduces the employment level at the margin. But if the level of employment is rising rapidly, let's say 10% is what it would rise at if you didn't do anything, and then you increase the minimum wage and induce some marginal unemployment, let's suppose that's, say, 3% down, you still have a 7% increase in employment, since people don't know that it could have gone up by 10%.
Right, okay.
Say, well, look, hey, what's the big deal? We raised the minimum wage, employment went up 7%. I don't see your point. And so that's the game that they play. And many econometricians who should know better do very careful econometric studies, and they control for this and they control for that, and these are quite competent people. But they're treating the data as though it's data like you would get by splitting an atom in an accelerator or something like that. That's not the case. There's politics behind the very thing you're observing. Since politicians are careful to not produce a large adverse effect, and they therefore rarely have the minimum wage above what the market wage is anyway, they're going to get almost no measured effect, and therefore they can give the people what they want, make them feel good about themselves. They voted a nice thing for poor people on the one hand, but without causing any kind of serious economic damage on the other.
But when you talk about the market minimum wage versus the actual federal mandate minimum wage, or whatever state mandate there might be, do you think that we're at that point? Because you're the economist, so let me just ask you. It would seem to me that in tougher economic times, if employers have the ability to pay $5.25, $5.50, maybe even $6, as opposed to $7.25, that in tougher economic times they would do that.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, there's two ways to look at it. One is, where are we in the business cycle? Are things booming, or are things difficult? If things are difficult, the standard textbook explanation for how an economy responds and recovers is that real wages fall. When real wages fall, labor becomes worth hiring again, and that's what gets people back to work. Well, for that to happen, you can't have something that keeps the wage above a certain amount. So over time, that's the issue there. The minimum wage gets in the way of real wages falling, so the worse the economic conditions are, the more likely the minimum wage is going to be a binding constraint, and it's going to therefore adversely affect employment at the margin. The other issue is where you are on the skill distribution. The vast majority of people don't make anything near the minimum wage, to make more than the minimum wage. But the people who are affected by the minimum wage are the people that I would argue we have to be the most careful about harming, and that's poor. It's poor people who might lose their job if a rich person self-righteously casts a vote in favor of increasing the minimum wage when they know it's not going to hurt them.
Because then those jobs might not be available.
Well, for the poor people. So,
right.
So, for example, a rich guy says, "Oh, I'm for poor people. I'm for this. I'm for that." So I have a way to demonstrate
because I want to help them out. Yeah.
I'm going to help them out, and I'm going to be against anybody who's against the minimum wage.
This would be a rich liberal person, but this is just me filling in the blanks here. But go ahead.
Well, actually, I really do believe that the minimum wage is probably the finest example of the kinds of thing that's going on in politics. There was a wonderful book that came out a year or so ago by Brian Kaplan titled The Myth of the Rational Voter. And you would think that it would be a hysterical book advancing some kind of wacky theory, but in reality it's a very careful examination of evidence of the last 20, 30 years by very reputable political scientists, psychologists, and so on and so forth that bust a couple conceptions that people have about how people vote. And one of them is that some people think that everybody votes for their own pocketbook and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But in reality, it turns out the data really show that most people do vote in a way that comports with their conscience. So the problem really isn't that you've got a bunch of selfish voters. The problem is you have people that are voting what they think is the right way, but they just simply have the wrong theory about how the world works. And so the minimum wage is a great example where somebody can feel good about themselves, like they're helping people. They don't know any economics. They don't know that a minimum wage is simply an effective price floor, so of course it's going to cause a surplus, which is effectively unemployment in this context. They don't know any of that stuff. They just know if I was a poor person, I'd rather make $7.25 rather than $7.
Well, yeah, who wouldn't want to do that? But let me ask you, just as we close out here, given where we are in the economy right now, I mean, it's unlikely that there are going to be politicians out there, there's going to be any rollback in the minimum wage. That simply isn't going to happen. It's probably not feasible. So when it comes to the minimum wage and whatever problems it might be creating in making the job market a little bit more stagnant than it otherwise would be, is there anything to do?
Well, we talked about this a long time ago at the beginning of this recession, and that was the data involving the growing disparity between not really part-time work, but slack-in work. You'll recall the numbers kind of jumped up. People normally work 40 hours a week. They didn't fall to part-time, but they were only working like 37, or they were being forced to take furloughs and things like this. And how I said, on the one hand, this is kind of unprecedented and a little scary, and if you're a worker, you certainly don't like it. But on the other hand, it's a way that employers can effectively reduce the wage without...
By reducing the hours, yeah. I see what you mean.
Yeah, and so in a way, we may be enjoying a greater degree of wage flexibility, which could hasten the recovery more than if we didn't have that flexibility. So it's something that, there's actually kind of an upside to it. So I do think that the minimum wage right now might not be as bad as it normally is, but that's hardly a good argument for it. It's just a bad idea. It's a cynical manipulation of people's natural sympathies, of people who don't really know how markets work.
You would just let the market control it and dictate it.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of things I wouldn't just let the market control. I'm not a pure free market guy. But minimum wage, that's just something that I don't think can be defended.
All right, good enough. Always love to hear your thoughts on these things. David Rose, professor and chair of the Department of Economics at UMSL, who is showing your son around the campus of the University of Missouri-Columbia today, right?
That is correct.
All right, awesome. Have a great trip, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, thank you.
David Rose on KMOX, our forecast right after traffic. Susan Thomas, how are we looking?